When I first met Carol, it was in a small coffee shop in Seattle, miles away from the life I knew back home in Dallas. I had been there for a business conference, and the rain-soaked streets of the city felt like a world apart from the hot, dry pavement I was used to. The cafe had been a welcome reprieve after a long day of presentations, the smell of fresh coffee and baked goods cutting through the chill in the air. Carol was seated by the window, her auburn hair catching the dim afternoon light as she absently stirred a cup of tea. She looked up as I walked in, and for a moment, our eyes met. There was something about her gaze, calm, yet full of life, that made me pause. I ordered my coffee and, in an uncharacteristic burst of confidence, struck up a conversation. We talked for hours that day. She told me she was in town visiting friends and that she worked as a freelance designer. Her stories were full of vibrancy, peppered with just enough humor to keep me captivated. By the time the barista politely informed us they were closing, it felt as though we had known each other for years. After that chance encounter, we kept in touch. Long phone calls turned into weekend visits, and within a year, Carol had moved to Dallas to be with me. It wasn't long before we were married in a small ceremony surrounded by family and friends. I remember thinking, as I stood there watching her walk down the aisle, that I was the luckiest man in the world. Our life together was comfortable, even idyllic in its own way. Carol had a way of making everything feel lighter, more joyful. She had an eye for detail that turned our house into a home, her touch visible in every carefully chosen piece of decor, every plant thriving under her care. She filled our days with laughter, and her creativity seemed boundless. I worked long hours to provide for us, but I never minded. Carol was endlessly supportive, always reminding me that my hard work was appreciated. She had her own projects, of course, design contracts that she worked on from her sunny home office, but she made it a point to keep our lives balanced. We'd cook dinner together most evenings, trading stories about our days, and spend weekends exploring new places or simply enjoying each other's company. To me, life felt complete. Sure, we had our disagreements, but what couple didn't? If anything, I believe those small arguments only made us stronger, teaching us how to navigate life together. Carol always knew how to smooth things over, her charm and wit a balm to any tension. I never questioned her love for me. Why would I? Carol had woven herself so deeply into the fabric of my life that I couldn't imagine a reality without her. To me, she was my partner, my best friend, the person who made everything else worthwhile. At that point, I couldn't have imagined the cracks forming beneath the surface, invisible but growing. Looking back now, I see the little signs I missed, the moments where things didn't quite add up. But in those early years, I was blissfully unaware. My trust in Carol as solid as the ground beneath my feet. And so, I didn't notice when she started staying out late more often, or when she began taking frequent trips out of town. After all, she always had a reason. An art show she wanted to see, a design client she needed to meet. I trusted her implicitly, never once suspecting that the life we had built might not be as unshakable as I thought. In hindsight, I realize how naive I was. But at the time, I was just a man who loved his wife and believed, with every fiber of his being, that she loved him back. The first time Carol mentioned her new project, I was genuinely excited for her. She'd landed a big contract with a boutique hotel chain, looking to revamp their interiors. It was the kind of opportunity she had been dreaming of for years, a chance to make her mark and showcase her talent on a larger stage. One evening over dinner, she had mentioned she'd need to travel, casually twirling her fork in her salad as she explained. The client wanted her to see their properties firsthand, to get a feel for the space before she started drafting designs. I didn't think much of it. Why would I? Carol's work had always been important to her, and I admired her passion. The trip started small, an overnight stay here, a 2-day visit there. She'd return with stories about quaint hotels and eccentric owners, her phone bursting with photos of fabric swatches and furniture sketches. But gradually, the trips grew longer and more frequent. A week in Chicago, a weekend in Miami, 2 weeks in San Francisco. Each time, she came back looking radiant, her eyes sparkling as she recounted her adventures. I chalked it up to the thrill of doing what she loved, and I couldn't help but feel a swell of pride for her accomplishments. Still, there were moments that nagged at me, little things that didn't quite fit. Once, when Carol returned from a trip to New York, I noticed a faint but unfamiliar cologne lingering on her scarf. The hotel manager was a hugger. She laughed when I asked about it, waving off my question as if it were nothing. Then there was the time she came back with a new necklace, a delicate silver chain with a small emerald pendant. When I asked where she got it, she hesitated just a fraction too long before saying it was a gift from the hotel chain CEO, a token of appreciation for her hard work. I had pushed aside my unease and told her it was stunning, hoping my words sounded more convincing than I felt. After all, Carol was talented. Why wouldn't her clients want to show their gratitude? Looking back, those moments were like tiny sparks, warning signs of a fire I didn't yet see. The first real crack in my certainty came one quiet evening when I was organizing the garage. Carol was out of town again, this time in Los Angeles, working on what she called the centerpiece of the whole project. I was sorting through an old box of our things when I stumbled upon a crumpled receipt from a high-end jewelry store in New York. At first, I smiled, thinking it was from the necklace. But as I unfolded it, my stomach tightened. The date didn't match any of Carol's trips, and the purchase wasn't for an emerald pendant. It was for a pair of diamond cufflinks. I tried to convince myself, grasping at straws, that maybe she had bought them for me. But even as the thought crossed my mind, it felt hollow and unconvincing. Carol had never mentioned them, and there was no occasion that warranted such a gift. I couldn't shake the feeling that the cufflinks were connected to someone else. But even then, I brushed it aside. Carol had given me no reason to distrust her, and I wasn't about to start doubting her now. And yet, the feeling lingered. It was subtle at first, like an itch I couldn't quite scratch. I started paying closer attention, not because I wanted to catch her in a lie, but because I couldn't ignore the unease growing inside me. Carol had left her laptop on the kitchen counter, and I needed to send a document for work. It wasn't unusual for us to use each other's devices. Carol had my passwords, and I had hers. But as I opened her email, a draft caught my eye. It was addressed to someone named B, with a subject line that simply read, "Can't wait." My heart pounded as I hovered over the message, debating whether to click. In the end, I didn't read it. I told myself I trusted Carol, that whatever the message was about, it was probably innocent. But the fact that I hesitated at all left a bitter taste in my mouth. That night, as I lay in bed alone, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting between us. I didn't want to believe it, but the signs were becoming harder to ignore. Little did I know, the truth was closer than I could have imagined. The weeks after Carol returned from Los Angeles were a whirlwind of subtle but telling changes. Her schedule grew erratic, her demeanor seemed distant, and she began talking about new business ventures she'd been exploring. At first, I chalked it up to the stress of her career. Carol was ambitious. She had always been, and she thrived on taking on new challenges. But then, things began to shift in ways that made my gut churn. It started when I came home early one afternoon. I had wrapped up work ahead of schedule, thinking I'd surprise Carol with dinner plans. Instead, I was the one surprised. Her voice carried softly through the house, lilting and playful, a tone I hadn't heard her use with me in years. I followed the sound to her home office, where she sat at her desk with her back to the door. On her screen was a man I didn't recognize, grinning at her as they spoke. Their conversation was light, casual on the surface, but there was an undercurrent of something unmistakable, personal. I froze. Eavesdropping wasn't my style, but something about their laughter sent alarm bells ringing. I caught fragments of their exchange, plans for some future meeting, a shared joke that seemed to carry more weight than it should. Carol ended the call abruptly when she noticed me standing there, her expression giving nothing away. She greeted me with a perfectly even tone, claiming she hadn't heard me come in. But her voice was too even, too controlled. It made me uneasy. I forced a smile, pretending it was nothing. I told her I just finished work early, keeping my tone light, even though my insides were churning with unease. One evening, as we sat on the couch watching TV, her phone buzzed with a message. She glanced at it briefly, her face flickering with something I couldn't place before she turned the screen away. Normally, Carol was open about sharing her day, but this time, she slipped her phone into her pocket without a word. The breaking point came a week later. I had stayed late at the office, trying to catch up on a few lingering projects, when a coworker sent me a link to an online gallery. They mentioned it was from the gala carol and I had attended last month, suggesting I take a look. Curious, I clicked the link, scrolling through familiar faces. And then I saw it. There was Carol, arm in arm with a man I didn't know. The way they stood together, close, almost possessive, made my stomach drop. The caption beneath the photo named him as Ryan Carter, a prominent developer in Los Angeles. My hands trembled as I stared at the image. Carol hadn't mentioned anyone named Ryan. She certainly hadn't said anything about being photographed with him like this. When I got home that night, Carol was already in bed. Her phone lay on the nightstand, and for the first time in our marriage, I felt the overwhelming urge to look through it. I hated myself for even thinking about it, but the questions swirling in my mind wouldn't let me rest. Unlocking her phone wasn't hard. I knew her passcode. What I found, though, was far worse than I'd anticipated. Messages. Dozens of them. Late-night conversations with Ryan, full of inside jokes, affectionate nicknames, and plans for their next meeting. It was all there, laid bare in front of me, confirming the worst of my suspicions. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the screen. The woman I thought I knew, the life we had built together. It all felt like a lie. And yet, there was no denying the truth staring back at me. Carol stirred in her sleep, mumbling something unintelligible, and I quickly locked the phone and set it back on the nightstand. My heart pounded as I climbed into bed beside her, my mind racing. The next morning, I knew I had a decision to make. But for now, I needed more answers. The following morning, I felt like I was living someone else's life. Carol hummed softly as she poured coffee, moving around the kitchen like everything was fine. But everything wasn't fine. I couldn't unsee those messages or the photo from the gala. I decided not to confront her yet, not until I had the full picture. That day at work, I found myself scrolling through my phone, searching for information about Ryan Carter. It didn't take long to piece together a rough profile. A wealthy entrepreneur, based in Los Angeles, known for his extravagant lifestyle. His social media was a curated highlight reel of luxury, private jets, exclusive parties, and a rotating cast of glamorous people. But what struck me most was how often he mentioned a business deal involving Carol's company. The connections were too obvious to ignore. This wasn't just some fling. There was a deeper tie between them, and I needed to know what it was. When I got home that evening, Carol was in her home office again, the door slightly ajar. Her voice carried down the hall, low and conspiratorial. She dismissed the concern, her tone carrying a faint edge of impatience. She assured him that I wasn't suspecting anything and insisted she had everything under control. My blood ran cold. I stepped closer, careful not to make a sound. Her voice softened, taking on an almost teasing quality as she assured him she'd handle me, calling me predictable. There was a brief pause before she laughed, a light, carefree sound, the kind that could easily belong to someone with nothing to hide. Predictable. That word lodged itself in my mind like a thorn. I backed away quietly, retreating to the living room as my thoughts raced. She wasn't just lying to me. She was plotting something. Later that night, after Carol had gone to bed, I found myself drawn back to her phone. This time, I delved deeper into her messages, emails, and calendar. What I found painted a damning picture. There were cryptic notes about property appraisals, references to joint accounts, and discussions about legal loopholes. One email in particular caught my attention. It was from Ryan, titled Next Steps. The email detailed plans to liquidate assets, move money offshore, and secure ownership of certain properties, my properties. It was all carefully worded, but the intent was clear. They were planning to strip me of everything. I sat there in the dim glow of the screen, my chest tightening with a mix of fury and disbelief. The woman I had trusted, the woman I had built a life with, was orchestrating my financial ruin behind my back. The next morning, I decided to act. Over breakfast, I casually suggested we get away for a weekend, just the two of us. I told her it could be somewhere quiet, with no work or distractions, just time for us. Carol looked up from her coffee, a flicker of surprise crossing her face. She told me it was unexpected, but her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. I shrugged it off, replying that it had been a while since we had some time to ourselves. She nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful, before agreeing that it sounded nice. It was a gamble, but I needed to buy time. I couldn't confront her yet, not until I had my own plan in place. That night, while she slept, I started making calls. The days leading up to the weekend getaway were a blur. Every interaction with Carol felt like walking on a tightrope. I kept up appearances, forcing smiles and casual conversations while my mind churned with plans. I'd already contacted an attorney, a quiet, sharp woman named Rachel who specialized in high-stakes divorces. She didn't ask too many questions, just nodded as I laid out the situation and assured me she'd get to work immediately. I handed over everything I'd gathered: emails, messages, bank statements. Rachel had advised me to not let her know I was onto her. She warned that if she thought I suspected anything, she might accelerate her plans. So, I played my part. On Friday, we packed for the trip. Carol seemed unusually cheerful, humming to herself as she folded clothes into a suitcase. She glanced over at me with that practiced smile and said this was going to be good for us. I nodded, managing to return the smile, agreeing that it would be nice to unwind. The place I chose was a secluded house a few hours' drive from the city. Carol didn't question it. She probably saw it as a chance to further manipulate me, to keep me wrapped around her finger. But I had my own agenda. The first night at the house passed uneventfully. We cooked dinner together, drank wine by the fireplace, and talked about nothing of consequence. It felt surreal, sitting across from her, pretending everything was fine, knowing what I knew. It was late when I slipped outside, feigning a need for fresh air. In reality, I needed space to think, to steady myself for what was coming. The woods were dark and quiet, the kind of stillness that amplifies your heartbeat. As I stood there, staring at the moonlit trees, I heard it, a faint rustle behind me. Carol's voice cut through the silence, smooth and nonchalant, asking if I couldn't sleep. I turned to her, forcing a smile as I said I just needed a minute. She stepped closer, her gaze searching mine. For a moment, I wondered if she suspected something, but then she just shrugged and told me not to stay out too long. It was freezing. I nodded, watching as she disappeared back inside. My mind raced. Something about her tone felt off. The next morning, I executed the next phase of my plan. I suggested we go for a hike, a long one, up to a scenic overlook. Carol hesitated, clearly not thrilled at the idea of physical exertion, but I insisted, framing it as a chance to reconnect. As we climbed, she became more talkative, her usual guardedness slipping away. At one point, she laughed, a sound that once would have made me happy. Now, it just felt hollow. We reached the overlook around noon. The view was breathtaking, miles of forest stretching out under a clear blue sky. Carol stood at the edge, taking it all in. Carol asked if it was beautiful, her back to me. I agreed, my voice steady despite the storm brewing inside. This was it. I stepped closer, saying her name. When she turned, her expression was curious, and I knew I had her attention. Then, I quietly admitted I knew about Ryan, and the words hung in the air like a thunderclap. For a moment, her face froze, but she quickly recovered, laughing nervously, trying to dismiss it. She asked what I was talking about. I didn't give her a chance to deflect. I told her I had seen the emails, the texts, the plans she'd made to take everything from me. Her smile faded, and I could see her guard shift to something colder, harder. She asked if I had been spying on her. I shot back, refusing to let her twist it. I told her I trusted her, I loved her, and yet she had been plotting behind my back the whole time. She crossed her arms, adopting a defiant posture, and told me I wasn't as innocent as I liked to think. She claimed if I had been more attentive, maybe this wouldn't have happened. I interrupted her firmly, making it clear that none of this was my fault. She had made her choices. Finally, she sighed, her expression softening into something almost pitying as she told me I was too naive for my own good. She said that had always been my problem. I stared at her, my chest tight with a mix of anger and disbelief. I told her it was over, that I had already spoken to a lawyer. By the time we got back, everything would be in motion. Her eyes narrowed, and for the first time, I saw something close to fear in her expression. She demanded to know what I had done. I didn't answer. Instead, I turned and started walking back down the trail, leaving her standing there alone. The walk down from the overlook was eerily silent. I could feel Carol's presence behind me, the weight of her stare boring into my back like a dagger. I didn't look back, didn't offer any more words. I had said enough. When we got to the house, she slammed the door behind her, rattling the old wood. Her voice was sharp as she called my name, demanding to know what I was doing. I turned to face her, asking, "What?" She stood there, hands clenched into fists at her sides, her eyes blazing. She wanted to know exactly what I thought I was trying to accomplish. I told her simply, though my heart was pounding, that I was taking back control. She laughed bitterly, telling me I was kidding myself. She said I was playing a game I didn't understand. I crossed my arms, leaning against the counter, and challenged her. I asked her to enlighten me, to tell me what her grand plan was, whether it involved seducing me into handing over everything or playing the happy wife until she bled me dry. She stepped closer, her expression shifting. It was subtle, but I caught it, the flicker of calculation behind her anger. She softened her tone, telling me I was blowing things out of proportion. She admitted we'd had problems, but insisted this wasn't what I thought. I snapped at her, my voice echoing through the house as I told her to stop lying. I had seen everything, the messages with Ryan, the plans to take the business, the house, everything. Her face froze for a moment, but then she smirked, asking if I thought I was so clever. I told her coldly that I wasn't playing games. She shook her head, chuckling softly to herself. She said I had always underestimated her, and that was my first mistake. Before I could respond, she turned and walked into the bedroom, slamming the door behind her. I stayed where I was, letting the tension in the room settle. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the windows set my nerves on edge. I didn't trust her, not anymore. Around midnight, I heard her moving around. I stayed quiet, pretending to sleep as she crept into the living room. My eyes cracked open just enough to see her rifling through my jacket, her movements quick and deliberate. I waited until she slipped out the front door before I got up and followed. The night air was frigid, biting at my skin as I stepped outside. Carol was heading toward the car, her phone pressed to her ear. Her voice was soft but insistent, like she said I knew. She insisted they had to do it now, and that she couldn't wait for him to get there. She told him to just stick to the plan. My stomach dropped. Whoever she was talking to, Ryan, I assumed, was on his way here. I stepped back inside before she could notice me, my mind racing. If Ryan showed up, this could turn dangerous. I had to act quickly. Grabbing my phone, I called Rachel, my attorney. She answered groggily, her voice thick with sleep. I whispered that I needed help, quickly explaining the situation. Her voice became urgent as she told me I needed to leave. She warned that if she was bringing someone there, I could be in danger and urged me to get out now. I hesitated, glancing toward the door. Part of me wanted to confront them, to face whatever was coming head-on. But Rachel was right. I couldn't risk it. I packed a bag in record time, slipping out the back door just as headlights appeared at the end of the driveway. I crouched behind a tree, watching as a sleek black car pulled up. Ryan stepped out, his silhouette illuminated by the car's interior light. Carol met him on the porch, her voice cutting through the still night air as she told him we didn't have much time and that I knew everything. Ryan cursed under his breath, running a hand through his hair. He said she should have handled this sooner. Carol snapped back, admitting she hadn't thought I'd figure it out. I stayed hidden, my heart pounding as I watched them disappear into the house. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a message from Rachel. "Call the cops now. Don't try to handle this alone." I hesitated for a moment before dialing, my hands shaking. I called 911, and in my voice, barely audible, I explained that there were 2 people in my house and I suspected they were planning something dangerous. The operator asked for details, but I barely heard her. My focus was on the house, on the shadows moving inside. The next few minutes felt like hours. I stayed hidden, my breath visible in the cold air, until the sound of approaching sirens broke the silence. Carol and Ryan ran out of the house, their faces pale. When Carol spotted me, she shouted, asking what I had done. I stepped out of the shadows, my voice steady despite the fear coursing through me, and told her it was over. The tension in the air was so thick it felt suffocating. I watched as Ryan's face twisted with panic. Suddenly, he rushed to his car, pulled the folder from inside, and threw it into the woods, all in a desperate frenzy. It was then that the police arrived. The flashing lights painted the scene in bursts of red and blue. 2 officers stepped out, their sharp eyes scanning the chaotic scene before them. One of them asked what was going on, his tone calm but commanding. I gestured toward Ryan and Carol, struggling to keep my voice steady as I explained to the officer that I believed Ryan and my wife were conspiring to rob me, to take everything I owned. Carol's laughter cut through the air, sharp and mocking. She sneered, her voice dripping with disdain as she asked if I was serious. She told me I had completely lost it, that I was paranoid, and maybe I needed some help. Her words cut deep, but I refused to let them shake me. Turning to the officers, I kept my voice firm as I explained what I had seen. I told them that when they pulled up, Ryan had thrown something into the bushes. He grabbed a folder from his car and threw it away. The officers exchanged glances, and then one of them nodded. He told me they'd take a look and asked me to show them where. They moved next to where the folder had landed. Inside were documents, crisp, legal-looking papers that made my stomach churn as I read the headings. They were forged documents, with signatures meant to look like mine. These weren't just random papers. They were designed to transfer my property and assets to someone else. The officer's voice turned cold as he turned his attention to Ryan, asking if he cared to explain. Ryan stumbled over his words, sweat forming on his forehead as he stammered that he didn't know what those were and claimed someone was setting him up. Carol stepped forward, her voice frantic as she insisted it wasn't what it looked like and claimed it was all a mistake. But the evidence was damning. The officers weren't buying their excuses. One officer pulled out a pair of handcuffs, his voice even as he told Ryan he was under arrest for attempted fraud and conspiracy. Ryan's face drained of color as the cold metal snapped around his wrists. Carol looked horrified, her mockery from earlier replaced with desperate pleading. The other officer turned to Carol, his tone firm as he informed her that she was coming with them as well, and that they would need to sort out her involvement at the station. Carol's voice cracked as she began to protest, insisting she didn't do anything, but the officer cut her off, telling her she could explain everything later. As they led Ryan and Carol to the police car, I stood there, my heart pounding in my chest. The truth was finally out, but the weight of it all pressed down on me. I stood frozen as the police car pulled away, its flashing lights fading into the distance. The whirlwind of the past few weeks, hell, maybe even years, felt like it was crashing down all at once. Ryan was in cuffs and Carol, the woman I had built a life with, was taken right alongside him. The next few days blurred together. I spoke with the police several times, reviewing the documents they had found and providing any information I could. It turned out that Ryan had forged multiple sets of papers. Some were to transfer property, others to sell off assets. They even uncovered a shared bank account he and Carol had opened under aliases, clearly meant to stash whatever they could siphon off from me. But the most damning revelation came when I sat down with Carol's lawyer. She had left a digital trail, emails, texts, even voice memos, spelling out their plan in horrifying detail. She hadn't just betrayed me. She had mocked me in the process, describing me as an easy mark and laughing about how naive I was. That was the dagger. I could deal with her falling out of love with me, even her cheating, but the sheer contempt in her words was something I couldn't shake. The divorce was swift. With the mountain of evidence against her, Carol didn't even bother to contest anything. She signed the papers, and just like that, she was gone from my life, legally and emotionally. Months later, I found myself in a completely different city, starting over. I sold the house. There was no way I could live there anymore, and moved into a modest apartment. I changed jobs, trading the high-stakes corporate world for something quieter, something that let me sleep at night. And slowly, life started to feel normal again. Every now and then, I'd hear about Carol and Ryan. They had both faced charges, Ryan for fraud. She got a lighter sentence, likely because she'd cooperated with the investigation, but Ryan wasn't so lucky. Looking back, I wouldn't say I'm thankful for what happened, but I've learned. Betrayal cuts deep, but it doesn't define you. People can take your trust, your love, even your time, but they can't take your ability to rebuild.